The general question is, how do you secure security of supply, energy security? And the general answer from an economic viewpoint is always the same. You do this by diversifying your sources. That's fine, you know, so now you go in a crude oil market, it's a globalized, integrated market, it should be diversified. But behind that is another question, which is the question, if you are a consuming country, are you better off importing crude oil, which we have just discussed, or are you better off importing refined products? If you import crude oil, then you have to do the refining domestically. If you import refining products, then you get it from somebody who has refineries. And that's not necessarily a trivial problem. And the reason for this is that the market for refined products is very, very different from the market for crude oil, simply because it is a very competitive, it's a global market, but it's very competitive and very fragmented. So it is not the kind of market where you have a cartel protecting producers in any way. Consequently, we are in a situation where actually refining capacity has to consolidate. Some refineries will have to close, and the process has already started. Now, interesting is the question, where has this capacity been created? And it has been created exactly in that part of the world where oil demand has been strong, in the non-OECD, in the developing world. If in doubt, countries like China, India, and most of the Middle Eastern countries will be able to command government support. They will be able to command subsidies rather than having to close down a big refinery which they still produce. That is much harder to do in Europe or North America than it is in India, China, or the Middle East. And that is why the closures which we have seen so far have taken place in the OECD economies, in the old marketplace, the highly industrialized countries. Now the question then going forward is, of course, well, what's the big deal? There may be oversupply right now, but surely, you know, the markets will return to growth and that oversupply will go away. And when you look at it more closely, when you do all the numbers, it turns out that this is actually perhaps not the case. It will be a long, long while until this refining capacity will find customers. Why? This is our internal forecast, which we do about how energy markets will develop until 2030. And this shows you the composition of fuels which we expect by 2030 globally. It shows you oil demand growing from today, maybe 85 million barrels per day, to then something like 98 million barrels per day, but the growth overall is rather slow. And some of it will be covered by biofuels. Where does the growth come from on the left-hand side? As I said already, OECD demand is falling, and also the oil which is getting more expensive, which is used for power production, will be falling, industrial use will be falling. The prime driver of this demand growth is going to be transport in the developing countries. That's going to grow, and that is what will ask this product demand. But now if you take this together and you ask yourself, how does this additional demand until 2030 place itself out in the face of today's overcapacity, we come to a very straightforward result. What we see here is the total additional demand which will be necessary, according to these estimates, by the year 2030 is 14 million barrels per day. And I should give you a footnote before I go on. We should be clear about one thing. In this business, because investment projects are so large and investment takes such a long time, it's pretty safe to make predictions 10 years out. It's a bit more hazardous to do them 20 years out as I'm doing here. But when I compare our forecast with ExxonMobil, with the International Energy Agency, with everybody else, the differences are really, really minor. They're all in the single percentage range. So we're not talking about some private forecast which is different from what everybody else is saying. So back to the topic, according to this, total demand will be around, say, 14 million barrels per day. But a large part of that will be what we call non-gas liquids, which doesn't need to be refined, the yellow thing, biofuels, which doesn't need to be refined. And then China has already announced plans to build a refinery that we can safely assume that China will be autonomous. If anything, they will do what they're doing now, which is to sell refining products into export markets, but they will not need any additional refined products from the outside world. They just have this kind of policy. And what is left over is about 3 million barrels per day. Now, the capacity increase this year alone was 2 million barrels per day. Last year, it was also 2 million barrels per day. So there is little to none scope for additional capacity. Refining remains a very cyclical element in this energy complex with very long cycles. What does all of this have to do with our initial question? How do you optimize your imports for energy security? And what does all of this have to do with the case of South Africa? Because of the violent nature of the crude oil market, where you have a cartel and can do all sorts of havoc, it can drive prices up, it can collapse and bring prices down in a violent way, it can cut you off the price and so on. And because of the need to optimize the existing global refinery structure, normally countries do not import only crude or import only products, refined products. What countries do is they develop some sort of mix. South Africa is very similar in this regard. It's not a big outlier. Here you have it in terms of barrels per day. South Africa imports about 70,000 barrels a day. That's a very small amount. Mixes, imports crude, and imports some products. It's a product importer. Now, if you would build a modern refinery today in South Africa, you would have to plan a size of about 200,000 barrels per day. That's sort of the minimum optimal size to build a healthy refinery. If this were to happen, then South Africa would immediately jump and become an export-dependent producer of refined products. This 200 additional barrels per day would be much more than the 70,000 they're currently importing, and the rest would have to be exported. Now, South Africa has some other advantages, one of which is geographic position and the other one is size. When you look at it, some of these large new capacity is right around the corner and can easily reach the country. So you have Middle Eastern imports here, you have India there, which has a huge mega refinery. You have new refining capacity in Korea. In fact, the South African market is so small, and that surprised me when I saw it, that when you take the total exports, only the net exports, of only those three regions, Middle East, India, and South Korea, South Africa's demand for imports is only 2% of that. So it's very unlikely that you suddenly can't get your products. It's not only a buyer's market with huge oversupply, it's also that what you actually want is a very, very, very small share of that market. Now what that means, and then I'm not here to give advice to anyone or to push anything on anyone, but what this means from an economic perspective is that there is true value in what we economists call option value, in optionality, in leaving an option open. In a situation like that, you could build a refinery right now, and you would be a little bit like these famous countries who would be very expensive costs to create domestic food supply because they want to be independent. It's an expensive proposition. You could do it right now. You would end up being forced to export products in a world where exporting products isn't easy, and in a world where this is going to remain the case for some years to come, for a long time to come, actually. Or one could choose a mixture where one says, okay, it's a buyer's market, why not stay on the side of those who buy it, and then wait. If all these forecasts turn out to be terribly wrong, you have a review every X years, then you can still go ahead and build a new refinery and start exporting it in a better market. But there's value in keeping all options open and being thoughtful of these things. And that, I think, is sort of what falls out when you look with the eyes of an economist at how these markets have behaved during the crisis, how they have come out of the crisis, and then you try to apply that to the situation of a relatively small economy in the middle of this emerging market complex, which is growing like an emerging market, which has growing demands which need to be fulfilled, and which wonders about its energy security. And then all of a sudden it does make sense to be careful and to distinguish oil from oil, crude oil from refined products. And the picture which emerges is one which is unfortunately rather more complicated than many people, which we saw today, some of them would have it. I'll stop here, and I want to encourage you to ask not only about these things, but anything you want. The more of an interesting discussion we have, the better. Thank you very much.